Dr. Harold Perelson. He was born in 1908, the son of immigrant parents who came to America with nothing but belief in hard work, education, and the promise that this country rewarded those who earned their place in it. Harold did exactly that. He studied relentlessly, rose above his circumstances, and became a cardiologist, one of the most respected professions in mid-20th century America. By the 1950s, Dr. Perelson was not just a doctor. He was a successful author of medical textbooks, a wealthy man, and a trusted figure in Los Angeles society. He married Lillian Perelson, a devoted wife, elegant and warm, the kind of woman who held a family together quietly and without recognition. Together, they had 3 children. Their eldest daughter, Judy, was approaching adulthood. The younger 2 were still children, growing up in comfort, security, and routine. They lived at 2301 Glendower Place, Los Feliz, a large Spanish-style mansion overlooking the city. From the outside, the house was a monument to achievement. Inside, it looked like the end of the American journey: a successful man, a loyal wife, healthy children, and Christmas decorations already hanging on the walls. Then came December 5, 1959. There were no signs of struggle earlier that day. No arguments heard by neighbors. No calls for help. That night, the family went to bed as they always had. By morning, one woman would be dead. One daughter would be fighting for her life. 2 children would run into the street screaming. And Dr. Harold Perelson would be found dead in his own home. This was not a crime born in chaos. It was born in silence. And to understand how a man with everything became the architect of his family's destruction, we must go back long before the blood, long before the screams, to the life that was already breaking behind closed doors. Before his name was ever whispered in horror, Harold Perelson was spoken with admiration. He was born in 1908, at a time when America was still shaping its identity, still deciding who would be allowed to succeed and who would be left behind. His parents were immigrants, people who labored quietly, invisibly, believing that sacrifice today would buy opportunity tomorrow. They gave their son what they themselves never had permission to dream: bigger than his circumstances. From an early age, Harold stood apart. While other children played, he studied. While others were satisfied with modest goals, Harold was restless. He did not want a life of survival. He wanted recognition. He wanted importance. He wanted to become someone whose name carried weight. Medicine became his path. In the early 20th century, doctors were not merely professionals, they were authorities. They were trusted without question, listened to without challenge. They occupied a rare position in society, standing at the intersection of science, morality, and life itself. To become a physician was to rise above ordinary men. Harold Perelson excelled. He worked his way through medical school with relentless discipline, pushing himself harder than those around him. Failure was not an option. Weakness was not a language he spoke. He specialized in cardiology, a field still unlocking the mysteries of the human heart, the organ most closely associated with life, death, and destiny. By the time he completed his training, Harold was no longer the son of immigrants. He was Dr. Perelson. Patients trusted him with their lives. Families thanked him as if he had performed miracles. His reputation grew, and so did his confidence. In his hands were stethoscopes, charts, and scalpels, but also something less visible and far more intoxicating: control. In that era, doctors were treated almost like gods. They were believed to understand the body in ways ordinary people never could. And Harold embraced that belief fully. He didn't just heal hearts. He believed he mastered fate itself. His ambition did not stop at medicine. Harold saw opportunity where others saw limits. In the 1950s, he began writing and publishing medical textbooks, authoritative works that were adopted by schools across the country. These books transformed him from a respected physician into a wealthy man. Royalty checks arrived regularly, reinforcing the idea that everything he touched turned to success. Money followed. Status followed. Admiration followed. And then came the final piece of the picture: family. Harold married Lillian, a woman whose quiet grace complemented his intensity. She was devoted, supportive, and deeply invested in the life he was building. Where Harold was driven and exacting, Lillian was gentle and stabilizing. Together they appeared to form a perfect balance. They had 3 children. Their eldest daughter, Judy, was intelligent and sensitive, standing on the edge of adulthood. The younger two children completed the image of domestic perfection, a household filled with structure, routine, and expectation. And presiding over it all was the house. In 1951, the Perelson family purchased a large Spanish-style mansion at 2301 Glendower Place, nestled in the hills of Los Feliz overlooking Los Angeles. The neighborhood itself was elite, home to professionals, artists, and people who had made it. The house was more than shelter, it was a declaration. 3 stories, expansive rooms, elegant details. A view that reminded its owner, every single day, how far he had climbed. Inside, the home was carefully arranged. Furniture chosen to reflect taste. Decorations placed with intention. By the late 1950s, Christmas ornaments already hung from the walls, a tree stood waiting, and wrap presents sat beneath it. From the outside, the Perelson family appeared untouchable, a brilliant doctor, a loyal wife, 3 well-cared-for children, a mansion on a hill. This was the American dream, realized. But perfection has a dangerous quality. It leaves no room to fall. Behind the polished image, expectations grew heavier. Harold demanded excellence from himself, from his work, from his family. Success was not just desired, it was required. Anything less felt like annihilation. And the higher he climbed, the more catastrophic the fall would become. Because when a man builds his entire identity on being flawless, the smallest crack becomes a threat, and the fear of losing everything can be more powerful than love itself. Everything looked perfect, and that was the most dangerous part of all. For years, Harold Perelson believed he was untouchable. Success had followed him so consistently that it no longer felt earned, it felt guaranteed. His medical textbooks had once been staples in classrooms, praised for their authority and clarity. Royalty checks arrived with comforting regularity. Money flowed quietly, reinforcing the idea that his intellect alone could sustain his lifestyle forever. But the world was changing. By the late 1950s, medicine was advancing rapidly. New voices emerged. New research replaced old authority. Medical schools began adopting updated materials, written by younger doctors with fresher reputations. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, Harold's books stopped selling. The checks grew smaller, then irregular, then, at times, they didn't come at all. To an ordinary man, this would have been a setback. A problem to solve, a signal to adapt. But Harold Perelson was not an ordinary man, and he did not experience failure the way others did. For Harold, money was not the true loss. Status was his wealth had become proof of his brilliance. His success had become evidence of his worth. To lose financial ground meant something far more terrifying: the possibility that the world might no longer see him as exceptional, and worse, that he might be forced to see it himself. He began borrowing. Quietly at first, loans taken out to maintain appearances. Expenses justified as temporary necessities. The mansion on Glendower Place still needed to be maintained. The lifestyle still had to be upheld. Christmas still had to look like Christmas. The debts were carefully hidden. Lillian was told little. The children knew nothing. From the outside, nothing appeared to have changed. Harold continued to dress well. He continued to speak with confidence. He continued to project the image of a man in control. But behind closed doors, panic took root. Bills piled up, accounts thinned, the future narrowed. And for a man whose entire identity was built on mastery, the idea of exposure became unbearable. To Harold, losing money was humiliating, but losing dignity was annihilation. He could accept struggle, he could not accept shame. In his mind, failure was not a phase. It was a verdict. As pressure mounted, his behavior began to shift. Sleep became elusive. Nights stretched endlessly as Harold lay awake, staring into darkness, replaying numbers, imagining conversations, rehearsing justifications that would never be spoken. Insomnia hollowed him out, leaving him sharp-edged and brittle. His patience vanished. Small inconveniences sparked sudden anger. Minor disagreements escalated into cold, cutting remarks. The warmth that once filled the house was replaced by tension, subtle, at first, then unmistakable. Lillian noticed the change. She sensed the distance, the irritability, the way Harold seemed perpetually elsewhere, locked inside his own thoughts. But Harold brushed off concern. He dismissed questions. Admitting distress would mean admitting weakness, and weakness was unacceptable. As the weeks passed, his thinking grew darker. He became suspicious, convinced that others were judging him, That colleagues were aware of his decline. That whispers followed him into rooms. Paranoia crept in quietly, disguising itself as vigilance. Death, once a clinical concept he managed daily as a physician, began to occupy his private thoughts. Not as a fear, but as an idea. An ending, a solution, a way to regain control. This was the cruel irony of Harold Perelson's unraveling. He was a man trained to recognize symptoms, to diagnose breakdowns, to intervene before it was too late. Yet when it came to his own mind, he refused to acknowledge the signs. The doctor who saved lives would not save himself. Inside him, something was shifting. The careful, disciplined professional was being overtaken by something more rigid, more desperate. His world had become binary: success or ruin, control or exposure, dominance or annihilation. There was no room for help, no room for confession, no room for recovery. And so the fracture widened. What began as financial anxiety transformed into existential terror. What began as sleepless nights evolved into obsessive thoughts. What began as pride hardened into something far more dangerous. The monster did not appear suddenly on that December night. It was built slowly, in silence, in denial, in a mind that could not accept its own vulnerability. Day by day, Harold Perelson moved closer to the edge, and when a man believes the world is about to witness his collapse, he may decide that destruction is preferable to humiliation. The cracks were already there. The only question was when they would finally split everything apart. The house on Glendower Place was silent. Not the peaceful kind of silence, but the kind that presses down, heavy and expectant, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Outside, Los Angeles slept. Streets were empty. Windows were dark. Across the city, families rested beneath blankets, unaware that somewhere in the hills, a nightmare had already begun to stir. Inside the Perelson home, Christmas waited. A tree stood fully decorated, ornaments catching faint reflections from the room's low light. Wrapped gifts rested beneath its branches, untouched. Everything was prepared for a morning that would never arrive. Upstairs, the family slept. Lillian lay beside her husband, unaware that the man next to her had already crossed a point of no return. The children rested in their rooms, safe in the belief that night meant protection, that parents meant safety. But one man was awake. Harold Perelson did not pace. He did not hesitate. Whatever internal battle had once existed was over. The fear of exposure, the terror of failure, the humiliation he imagined waiting for him, it had hardened into resolve. In his mind, this was not murder. It was control. He moved through the house deliberately, without urgency. The stillness did not alarm him, it empowered him. The silence felt like permission. In the bedroom, Lillian never had a chance to understand what was happening. There was no argument, no confrontation, no warning. In the darkness, the woman who had shared his life, supported his ambitions, and trusted him completely was reduced to a final, irreversible moment. A marriage that had lasted decades ended without a word. The house remained quiet. Then, somewhere down the hall, a sound broke through the stillness. Judy woke. She did not wake to screams. She woke to something far more confusing: movement, shadows, the wrongness of the air itself. In seconds, confusion turned to terror. The reality of what was happening crashed down on her without explanation or mercy. She fought. She screamed. She resisted. The man standing before her was no longer her father. The familiar face had become unrecognizable, stripped of warmth, stripped of restraint. In his place stood someone cold, purposeful, and unreachable. A home became a battlefield. Noise exploded through the house: footsteps, cries, chaos tearing through rooms that had once been orderly and calm. The younger children woke to fear they could not yet name. Instinct took over. Doors opened, feet ran. Survival became the only language spoken. Somehow, impossibly, Judy stayed alive. Bleeding, disoriented, driven by nothing but the need to escape, she gathered her siblings and fled the house. The door that had once symbolized security now became an exit from hell. Outside, dawn was beginning to break. Their screams carried through the neighborhood, slicing through the illusion of safety that defined Los Feliz. Lights turned on. Doors opened. Neighbors emerged into a reality they would never forget. Inside the mansion, the violence ended as abruptly as it had begun. Harold Perelson descended into the basement alone. There, away from witnesses, away from judgment, he completed what he had already decided. The same man who had dedicated his life to studying the heart now turned against his own. When authorities would later find him, The weapon lay nearby, the final act already finished. The house fell silent again. But this time, it was different. This was not the silence of anticipation. It was the silence of aftermath. By morning, police filled the property. Reporters gathered. Neighbors whispered. The story began to spread, stripped of nuance, compressed into headlines and official statements. Murder-suicide, they called it. A phrase clean enough to hide the horror beneath it. Harold Perelson had escaped trial. He had escaped questioning. He had escaped the moment where the world would look him in the eye and see him as he truly was. But he did not escape history. Because the house remained. The survivors remained. And the truth, ugly, uncomfortable, and irreversible, remained. A respected doctor had annihilated his own family. A symbol of success had become a monument to failure. A Christmas meant for celebration became a permanent scar. That night did not end when the sun rose. It lingered in memory, in rumor, in the walls of the mansion that would stand untouched for decades. Harold Perelson believed death would give him control instead. It ensured that his name would be remembered not for healing, but for the destruction he left behind. The night ended for Harold Perelson in the basement. But for his children, it never ended at all. They survived what no child should ever witness. They escaped a house that had transformed from a home into a slaughterhouse. And yet, survival did not mean freedom. It meant carrying the weight of that night into every day that followed. Judy survived physically barely. Her injuries healed, but the damage inside her mind never truly did. She had seen her mother die. She had looked into her father's eyes and realized that the man who was supposed to protect her had become something else entirely. That knowledge does not fade. It embeds itself deep, reshaping how the world is perceived. Trust becomes fragile. Safety becomes theoretical. Sleep becomes a battleground. For the younger children, memory itself became fractured. Their minds tried to protect them by blurring details, but the fear remained an unnamed dread that surfaced in nightmares, in sudden panic, in moments when silence felt too loud. After the tragedy, the children disappeared from public view. Their names were changed. Their identities rewritten. Los Angeles was left behind. It was not just an attempt to escape media attention. It was an attempt to escape a past that followed them relentlessly. In a city obsessed with image and narrative, they were living reminders of something no one wanted to acknowledge, that evil can be born inside the most respectable homes. They were moved away quietly, absorbed into new lives where no one knew their history. New schools, new neighborhoods, new faces. But trauma does not recognize geography. No matter where they went, the past traveled with them. Birthdays were never just birthdays. Holidays were never just holidays. And Christmas was forever poisoned. Every decorated tree, every wrapped gift, every quiet night carried echoes of blood and screams. What should have been symbols of joy became triggers, reopening wounds without warning. They grew up learning how to appear normal, to smile at the right moments, to answer questions without revealing too much, to keep their history locked away, even from themselves. But inside, the damage endured. Survivors of family annihilation often live with a crushing contradiction: gratitude for being alive, and guilt for having survived. Questions without answers haunt them endlessly. Why did he spare me? Why did I escape when my mother didn't? Was there something I could have done? These questions do not fade with time. They mature, evolve, and resurface in new forms as life moves forward. Careers are chosen cautiously. Relationships are approached carefully. Love is desired but feared. Because when the person who hurt you is also the person who loved you, the boundaries between danger and affection become dangerously blurred. The children of Harold Perelson did what they had to do to survive. They built lives. They aged. They moved forward. But they never truly left that house on Glendower Place. Because trauma does not stay where it begins. It imprints itself onto the nervous system. It becomes part of identity. They were not defined by what their father did, but they were shaped by it in ways that could never be undone. They lived, but they did not get their innocence back. They did not get their childhood back. They did not get their sense of safety back. They survived hell. And sometimes, that is not the same thing as being saved. After the bodies were removed and the police tape came down, the house did not return to normal. It froze. Inside the mansion on Glendower Place, time appeared to stop moving in December 1959. Calendars remained turned to that month, never flipped forward. Wrapped Christmas gifts sat unopened beneath the tree, their ribbons stiff with age. Decorations stayed exactly where they had been left, as if the family might return at any moment to finish what they had started. But no one ever did. The Christmas tree remained standing long after its needles dried and fell. Its branches turned brittle, its color faded, yet it was never taken down. It became less a decoration and more a relic, a silent marker of a moment that could not be undone. Rooms stayed furnished. Chairs remained pulled out. Lamps stood where they had last been switched off. Dust accumulated slowly, gently, like a second layer of skin over the past. It was not abandonment. It was preservation. When the house was eventually sold, the new owners made a strange decision. They never moved in. They did not renovate. They did not redecorate. They did not attempt to erase what had happened. Instead, the mansion was locked, its doors rarely opened, its windows staring out over Los Angeles like unblinking eyes. For decades, the house simply existed. And in its silence, stories began to grow. Neighbors spoke quietly about lights turning on when no one was inside. About shadows passing behind curtains. About sounds, footsteps, muffled cries, doors that seemed to close on their own. No one could ever prove anything, but proof was never the point. The house felt wrong. Urban explorers eventually found it. Drawn by rumor, curiosity, and the human urge to stand close to darkness, they slipped past fences and locks to enter the mansion. Inside, they reported the same unsettling details again and again: the stale air, the heavy stillness, the sense of being watched. Some claimed to hear whispers. Others described the overwhelming urge to leave, as if the house itself was rejecting them. Photos surfaced online. Grainy videos circulated. Each one added another layer to the legend. Was the house haunted? No one could say for certain. But the truth was simpler and perhaps more disturbing. This was a place where violence had not been processed, where grief had not been lived through, where closure had never arrived. Trauma had been sealed inside walls and left to echo endlessly. Time forgot this house. Memory did not. Even after the mansion was eventually renovated and prepared for a new future, its reputation followed it. No amount of paint or sunlight could fully erase what had happened there. Because buildings do not forget what they witness. They absorb it. The house on Glendower Place became more than wood and stone. It became a container for fear, grief, and unanswered questions. A monument not to ghosts but to human collapse. Whether spirits lingered or not almost didn't matter. What made the house terrifying was not what might be hiding inside it, but what had already happened there. And some places, once marked by horror, never truly let it go. Years passed. Then decades. Eventually, the house on Glendower Place changed hands once more. This time, it did not remain sealed. Workers arrived. Windows were opened. Sunlight entered rooms that had been dark for half a century. The dead tree was removed. The walls were repainted. The floors were restored. At night, lights turned on again. From the outside, the mansion no longer looked abandoned. It no longer looked cursed. To strangers driving past, it appeared like any other beautiful home perched in the hills of Los Feliz, elegant, desirable, alive. Life, it seemed, had returned. But some questions never left. New walls cannot erase what old ones witnessed. Fresh paint cannot absorb screams that once echoed through hallways. And silence, no matter how long it lasts, does not equal healing. Somewhere the children who escaped that night grew old. They lived under different names, in different places, surrounded by people who never knew the truth. To the world, they were ordinary individuals. But memory does not respond to reinvention. The past does not knock politely before returning. It appears in fragments: a sound in the dark, a sudden fear, a moment of distrust without reason. It lives in the body, in the nervous system, in the spaces between thoughts. No renovation can reach that deep. And so the story remains unfinished. Not because we lack facts. Not because the case was unsolved. But because the consequences never truly ended. The house still stands. The city still grows around it. Families still decorate trees every December, believing as they always have that home is the safest place in the world. And perhaps that is the most unsettling truth of all. Evil does not always announce itself. It does not always come from strangers. Sometimes it wears success. Sometimes it wears respectability. Sometimes it sleeps in the room next to yours. The house may be healed, its walls restored, its rooms filled with light, But memory does not fade so easily. And sometimes the most terrifying ghost is not the one that haunts a house, but the one that once lived inside a human heart. If this story stayed with you, if it made you uncomfortable, unsettled, or silent for a moment longer than usual, then it has done its job. Because this was never just a story about a house, or a crime, or a man who lost everything. It was a warning. A reminder that success can hide collapse, that silence can be deadly, and that the most dangerous battles are often fought behind closed doors. If you believe stories like this matter, stories that force us to look at the darker side of human nature, consider subscribing to the channel. Leave a comment below. Not just to share your opinion, but to ask yourself a harder question: how well do we really know the people closest to us? And if there is one lesson to take from this tragedy, it is this: mental collapse does not happen overnight. It grows quietly, and ignoring it can destroy more than one life. Talk. Listen. And never assume that silence means everything is fine. Thank you for watching.